The HOA president blocked my ranch gate with her SUV and ordered the sheriff to arrest me on my own land. I was hauling $40,000 worth of cattle back from auction when Bethann Whitmore, HOA president of Willowbrook Estates, parked her pearl-white Escalade sideways across my gate. Engine running, phone recording, smirk ready. "This is HOA property now," she said. "You're not coming through." Dust in the air, diesel in my nose, my cattle panicking in the trailer behind me, and her calling 911 like she'd just caught a thief. 20 minutes later, sirens hit the road. Bethann straightened up, confident she was about to watch me get arrested. But when the sheriff saw my federal credentials, everything changed, and Bethann was about to pay a price she never saw coming. Drop your craziest neighbor story below. Subscribe to see Bethann get exactly what she deserves. My name's Garrett Sullivan, and I'm what you might call an endangered species. A third-generation cattle rancher trying to make it work in 2024. 340 acres of prime Texas hill country that my grandfather carved out of cedar and limestone back when this was all mesquite and wild hogs. 2 years ago, I lost my wife Sarah to cancer. Now it's just me and my 17-year-old daughter Emma trying to keep the ranch running while I juggle my day job as a federal agricultural inspector with the USDA Rural Development Office. Not the most glamorous work, but it pays the bills and keeps the ranch afloat. The coffee was still steaming in my thermos that first morning when I realized our quiet corner of the world was about to change forever. Bulldozers had arrived across the fence line, turning my grandfather's Old South pasture, the 80 acres we sold to developers in 2019, into something called Willowbrook Estates. Now, before you think I'm some bitter old rancher mad at progress, let me set the record straight. The original developer, a guy named Jim Crawford, was decent folk, kept his promises about maintaining our easement road, even helped when we needed soil surveys for our water wells. The smell of fresh-turned earth and the mechanical hum of construction never bothered me much. Development was inevitable, and Crawford respected the agreements. But Crawford sold out 6 months after breaking ground. Enter Bethann Whitmore, 45 years old, fresh from Phoenix with her retired tech executive husband and a head full of property management ideas. She got herself elected HOA president faster than a summer thunderstorm, promising to protect property values through proactive community standards. That's corporate speak for "I don't like my neighbors." The first hint of trouble came as complaints about my roosters crowing at 6 a.m. Now, any fool knows roosters crow at dawn. It's what they do. But Bethann filed formal noise violations demanding I install sound mitigation barriers around my chicken coops. Then came the aesthetic fencing requirements. Apparently, my century-old split-rail fence didn't meet the visual standards of Willowbrook Estates. Never mind that my fence predated their community by 70 years. But the real issue was the road. See, when Grandpa sold that land back in the day, he was smart enough to keep an easement, a legal right-of-way that let us access our back 40 through what's now the corner of their development. That easement got written into every deed, every survey, every legal document since 1952. It's as permanent as the limestone bedrock under our feet. Bethann discovered this easement about 3 months into her presidency. Started parking residents' cars near the gate, forcing my cattle trailer to navigate around like we were running some kind of obstacle course. Then came the decorative boulders, landscaping improvements that gradually narrowed the passage until I could barely squeeze through with my pickup. The final straw came on transport day. I'd just bought $40,000 worth of Black Angus at auction, prime breeding stock that would secure our ranch's future for the next decade. These weren't just cattle, they were Emma's college fund, our retirement plan, and the continuation of 3 generations of careful breeding. I arrived at the gate to find Bethann's Escalade parked sideways, completely blocking access. She stood there in her designer workout clothes, you know the type, $100 yoga pants that never saw a day of actual work, claiming our easement expired when the development was built. "This is private HOA property now," she announced, recording everything on her phone. "You're trespassing, and if you move my vehicle, I'm calling the sheriff." $40,000 worth of stressed cattle. 12 miles of highway detour. 2 calves developed shipping fever from the extended transport, cost me $3,000 in vet bills. But Bethann had no idea what she'd just started. The courthouse smell hit me first. that musty combination of old paper and floor wax that every government building seems to marinate in. I'd spent the morning at the county clerk's office, photographing every easement document from 1952 forward while Beth Ann launched her first real offensive. She'd filed a formal complaint claiming my easement was fraudulent, demanding I pay for a professional survey to prove my rights. $4,500 out of my pocket, she insisted, or face legal action for ongoing trespassing violations. But here's what Beth Ann didn't count on. I actually read the fine print. While she was busy rallying her Facebook group Protect Willowbrook Values with posts about aggressive agricultural operations threatening our peaceful community, I was discovering some interesting facts. The original developer's purchase agreement specifically promised to honor all existing agricultural easements in perpetuity. Her own HOA's governing documents, the ones she apparently never bothered reading, acknowledged my easement rights in black and white. Even better, I learned something about easement law that every property owner should know. If you've used a property right continuously for over 20 years, it becomes legally permanent regardless of new development. Google prescriptive easement if you want to protect your own property rights. The mini twist came when I realized Beth Ann's petition drive had backfired spectacularly. She'd convinced 3 elderly residents to sign what she called a property rights protection petition, told them it would prevent any future boundary disputes. What she didn't mention was that the petition actually requested the county to investigate all property boundary disputes, including the HOA's own property lines. Turns out, when you ask the county to survey everything, they survey everything. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as the county surveyor spread his maps across the metal table, pointing to a problem Beth Ann had created for herself. That decorative entrance with the fancy stone pillars and the Willowbrook Estates sign, built 3 feet beyond their actual property boundary, right on county road easement. "Ma'am," the surveyor told her during the formal review meeting, "your HOA is technically trespassing on county property. You'll need to move this entire entrance or face potential legal action. $15,000 in survey costs, another 20 grand to relocate their entrance." All because Beth Ann tried to prove I was the one violating property rights. But did she take responsibility? Of course not. Instead, she accused me of manipulating the elderly residents as if I'd somehow hypnotized them into signing her own petition. She threatened a lawsuit for harassment and property damage, claiming I deliberately caused the survey investigation to hurt the HOA. The taste of bitter courthouse coffee still lingered as I watched her storm out of the surveyor's office, heels clicking like angry woodpeckers. She began photographing my daily activities, creating what she called an evidence file of my aggressive behavior patterns. Her social media campaign shifted into overdrive. Posts about the vindictive rancher threatening our safety appeared hourly. She shared selective photos of my cattle operations, calling them unsanitary conditions and potential health hazards. Monsieur, screenshots of my truck parked near the gate became evidence of stalking and intimidation. The irony was delicious. Every photo she took of me using my legal easement actually documented my legitimate property rights. Every complaint she filed created a paper trail proving continuous use of the road. Every social media post showed her escalating harassment campaign against someone simply trying to access his own land. But I knew this was just the beginning. Late one evening, as cicadas buzzed in the oak trees and the last light faded over the hills, I sat on my porch reviewing the stack of documents I'd gathered. Original survey maps from 1952, crisp and yellowed with age. Purchase agreements with easement clauses written in careful cursive. Deed restrictions that clearly protected agricultural use. Emma joined me with 2 glasses of sweet tea, ice clinking against the glass in the humid air. "Dad, why doesn't she just leave us alone?" "Because some people can't stand not being in control," I told her. "But sometimes when you dig a hole trying to bury someone else, you fall in yourself." I had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. Beth Ann was about to discover that attacking a federal employee's property rights was like kicking a hornet's nest. And I was about to learn that my day job gave me access to information that would change everything. The real war was just beginning. The security cameras appeared overnight like mechanical spiders, 3 of them aimed directly at my gate and ranch entrance. Beth Ann had installed a full surveillance system focused entirely on documenting my suspicious activities, which apparently included feeding cattle at dawn and maintaining my own equipment on my own land. 6 a.m. used to be peaceful. Steam rising from coffee cups, cattle lowing softly in the distance, that crisp morning air that makes you grateful to be alive. But now every morning started with Bethan's cameras tracking my movements like I was some kind of criminal. The noise complaints came fast and furious after that. Normal ranching activities that had happened for decades suddenly became nuisance violations. The diesel generator that powered my water pumps? Noise violation. My tractor starting up for morning chores? Disturbing the peace. Even the cattle themselves earned a complaint for excessive animal noise disrupting residential tranquility. But Bethan's masterpiece was the 6 a.m. confrontation. I was checking water troughs in my south pasture when she appeared at the fence line, designer coffee cup in one manicured hand, phone recording in the other. The smell of her expensive perfume clashed with the honest scent of hay and morning dew. "This has to stop," she announced, like some suburban sheriff laying down the law. "Your deliberate noise-making is harassment of our residents. I'm demanding you install soundproof barriers around your entire operation." I set down my feed bucket slowly. "Ma'am, this is a working ranch. Has been since before your grandparents were born." "That doesn't give you the right to terrorize our community," she shot back. "I'm reporting you to agricultural authorities for improper animal management. This ends now." She was recording everything, of course, building her case about the aggressive rancher who needed to be stopped. What she didn't know was that I'd installed my own cameras, perfectly legal on my own property, documenting every instance of HOA vehicles deliberately blocking my easement. While Bethan was busy playing detective, I was doing some investigating of my own. Court records are public information, and Bethan Whitmore had quite a history. Turns out she'd sued neighbors in her previous Phoenix HOA for property devaluation, claiming their swimming pool construction lowered her home value. The judge's ruling was brutal, warning her about frivolous litigation patterns and ordering her to pay the defendant's legal fees. More interesting was what I found about her credentials. She claimed to be a former legal consultant with expertise in property management law. In reality, she'd worked as a paralegal for exactly 8 months before being let go for interpersonal difficulties with clients and colleagues. But Bethan wasn't done escalating. Animal control showed up on a Tuesday morning responding to her complaint about neglect and abuse on my ranch. The inspector, a decent guy named Rodriguez, spent 3 hours examining every animal, checking feed supplies, reviewing veterinary records. "Mr. Sullivan," he told me afterwards, scratching his head, "I've been doing this job for 15 years, and your operation exceeds standards in every category. Whoever filed this complaint either doesn't understand livestock or was deliberately wasting our time." That same week brought a zoning compliance officer investigating Bethan's claim that my ranch violated residential area laws. Another waste of taxpayer resources, another official confirming what anyone with sense already knew. My ranch predated all residential zoning by decades. Here's something every rural property owner should understand. Agricultural right-to-farm laws protect established farming operations from nuisance complaints when neighborhoods develop around them. Research your state's specific protections before some HOA Karen tries to shut you down. But here's where Bethan's harassment campaign backfired beautifully. All those government inspections she'd demanded, they triggered automatic reviews of everyone's zoning compliance, including the HOA's. Turns out Willowbrook Estates had illegally converted common areas to private resident parking without proper permits. The county was now demanding $15,000 in retroactive fees and threatening to revoke their certificate of occupancy until violations were corrected. Meanwhile, Bethan escalated to economic warfare. She began pressuring local businesses to refuse service to my family. Called the feed store claiming I was under investigation for animal abuse. Contacted my veterinarian suggesting I might be financially unstable and unable to pay bills. Even tried to convince the local hardware store that my ranch was a safety hazard to the community. The owner of Miller's Feed and Supply, old Pete Miller, whose daddy had sold feed to my grandfather, called me personally. "Garrett, I don't know what B got in that woman's bonnet, but she's been calling here twice a day trying to get me to blacklist you. Thought you should know." The antiseptic smell of government offices had become unfortunately familiar as officials continued investigating Bethan's complaints. Each investigation cleared me completely while revealing new problems with HOA compliance. But she was far from finished. In fact, her next move would be the biggest mistake of her life. Social media had always seemed like a waste of time to me, but apparently Beth Ann had made it her full-time job. Through careful internet stalking, she'd discovered my federal position with USDA Rural Development. What she didn't understand was the scope of my authority, but that didn't stop her from seeing an opportunity for revenge. The complaint letter arrived at my supervisor's office on a Wednesday morning, filled with accusations that would have been laughable if they weren't so malicious. According to Beth Ann, I was using my federal position to intimidate neighbors and abuse government authority for personal vendettas. She'd created fake documentation suggesting I'd threatened federal retaliation against the HOA, complete with manufactured quotes and fabricated witness statements. The letter to our regional congressman claimed corruption in federal agricultural oversight and demanded an immediate investigation. The polyester government office chairs had that particular scratch of cheap fabric as I sat across from my ethics supervisor, Janet Morrison. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead while we reviewed every false accusation Beth Ann had manufactured. "Garrett," Janet said, spreading the complaint across her metal desk, "this woman has accused you of everything short of federal espionage. But here's the interesting part. Her complaints contain specific lies that are easily disproven. That's when I learned something that every federal employee should know. When someone files false accusations against you, it triggers an automatic review that often reveals the accuser's own violations. Janet's investigation required examining all rural development projects in our county, including any potential conflicts of interest. That's when we discovered that Willowbrook Estates had received multiple federal grants totaling $340,000. Environmental flood mitigation, $180,000. Rural infrastructure improvement, $95,000. Community development block grant, $65,000. All with specific compliance requirements that the HOA had systematically violated. The coffee from the government vending machine tasted like burnt cardboard as Janet explained the implications. "Garrett, this woman's harassment campaign has actually uncovered serious federal violations. We're legally obligated to investigate grant fraud regardless of how we discovered it." While I was dealing with ethics reviews, Beth Ann was escalating her professional sabotage campaign. She demanded an emergency HOA meeting to address what she called federal harassment, tried to rally residents to file a group complaint against me, even threatened to involve the FBI if my federal intimidation continued. What she didn't realize was that her complaints had opened a federal investigation that she couldn't control or stop. The review revealed that grant money designated for flood mitigation had been spent on decorative fountains. Environmental restoration funds had gone to importing palm trees instead of required native species. Infrastructure money had been diverted to aesthetic improvements rather than mandated drainage systems. Federal grant compliance reports had been filed with false information about project completion. Grant administrators had been deceived about the actual use of federal funds. The pattern showed systematic fraud spanning multiple years. Here's what every property owner should understand. Federal grant violations never expire, and new property owners inherit all previous compliance obligations. Ignorance isn't a defense in federal court. But Beth Ann wasn't finished destroying herself. Realizing her federal complaints were backfiring, she tried to withdraw them, claiming misunderstanding. Too late. Federal investigations don't stop because accusers get cold feet. She began pressuring the HOA board to hire a lawyer immediately, not understanding that local attorneys can't fix federal crimes. In a panic, she started destroying documentation of grant misuse, shredded financial records showing fund diversions, deleted emails discussing non-compliant spending, even tried to modify landscaping overnight to hide environmental violations. The irony was perfect. Every attempt to cover up violations created new federal crimes: obstruction of justice, destruction of federal evidence, interference with a federal investigation. The sterile smell of federal office buildings had become routine as I provided testimony about the harassment campaign and its connection to the grant fraud discovery. My ethics review concluded that I'd followed proper procedures throughout, maintaining complete separation between personal and professional duties. Beth Ann's desperation reached peak stupidity when she hired a private investigator to find dirt on my personal life. What the PI found instead was a 15-year pattern of community service, military veteran status, and spotless professional records that made Beth Ann's accusations look even more ridiculous. Her final professional attack was threatening to sue the USDA for allowing employee harassment. The federal legal department's response was swift and decisive. They launched a formal investigation into threats against a federal employee performing lawful duties. By trying to destroy my career, Bethan had inadvertently triggered a federal criminal investigation that would destroy her own life. The taste of bitter government coffee had become the flavor of justice, served cold and with federal authority behind it. But her biggest mistake was still coming. Next, she would try to go to war with the media and learn that truth always wins in the end. The manila folder felt heavier than it should have as I sat in Janet Morrison's office, reviewing the complete scope of Willowbrook Estate's federal funding violations. What had started as Bethan's petty harassment campaign had uncovered the kind of systematic fraud that sends people to federal prison. "Garrett," Janet said, her voice carrying the weight of 20 years in federal compliance, "this is bigger than we initially thought." The numbers were staggering. $340,000 in federal grants, all with specific requirements that had been systematically ignored or deliberately violated. Environmental flood mitigation, money spent on decorative features, rural infrastructure funds diverted to aesthetic improvements, community development grants used for unauthorized projects. But it wasn't just misuse, it was deliberate fraud. The grant applications contained detailed promises about native plant restoration, improved drainage systems, and environmental protection measures. The compliance reports filed annually claimed these projects had been completed according to federal specifications. Site photographs submitted to federal agencies showed work that had never actually been done. The previous HOA management originated most of this fraud, Janet explained, spreading out falsified compliance documents. But Bethan's continuation of the false reporting makes her legally liable for ongoing violations. Here's what every property owner needs to understand about federal grants. Compliance requirements never expire, and false reporting to federal agencies is a felony regardless of who started the deception. The environmental violations alone were stunning. Federal flood mitigation grants require specific native species plantings to prevent erosion and protect watersheds. Instead, the HOA had installed non-native palm trees that actually increase flood risk. Required drainage improvements had been replaced with decorative fountains that couldn't handle heavy rainfall. But the federal web was even more complex than simple grant misuse. False federal grant reporting carries automatic 5-year federal sentences. Grant money misuse requires immediate repayment with penalties and interest. Environmental violations trigger EPA involvement and additional fines. The total exposure exceeded $500,000 in fines and repayment obligations. The irony, Janet noted with a thin smile, is that if Bethan had simply left you alone, we might never have discovered any of this. Federal employees are legally obligated to report violations once discovered, regardless of how they're found. My personal conflict with Bethan didn't eliminate my professional responsibility. It actually made proper reporting more critical to avoid any appearance of impropriety. Bethan, meanwhile, remained completely ignorant of the legal avalanche she'd triggered. She continued believing I was somehow abusing federal power for personal revenge, not understanding that legitimate federal investigations operate independently of personal disputes. Her attempts to hire local lawyers showed she didn't grasp that federal crimes require federal defense attorneys with security clearances and specialized experience. The weight of federal compliance manuals made my desk sag as I reviewed the complete scope of violations. Environmental protection laws, grant fraud statutes, federal reporting requirements. Each violation carried its own penalties, and they compounded like interest on unpaid debt. But here's what made the situation truly dangerous for Bethan. Her escalating harassment campaign provided clear evidence of consciousness of guilt. Her attempts to destroy records showed she understood the severity of the violations. Her efforts to intimidate a federal employee demonstrated intent to obstruct justice. Her false complaints about federal harassment proved she was trying to deflect attention from legitimate criminal activity. Federal prosecutors love defendants who document their own crimes. As I prepared the formal compliance report, one thought kept echoing in my mind. Bethan had picked a fight with the wrong rancher at exactly the wrong time. Her petty power games had uncovered federal violations that would send her to prison and bankrupt the HOA she thought she controlled. Justice was coming, with federal authority behind it. The USDA Legal Department conference room felt like mission control, with federal compliance manuals stacked like small skyscrapers and evidence files organized with military precision. Attorney Sarah Campbell spread aerial photographs across the polished table, showing the stark contrast between what Willowbrook Estates had promised the federal government and what they'd actually built. "The pattern is clear," she explained, pointing to photos comparing grant applications to actual construction. Systematic fraud spanning multiple years continued under current management despite clear warning signs, while Bethann continued her harassment campaign, blissfully unaware of the federal trap closing around her. I was learning exactly how federal grant compliance works and why violations are treated so seriously. Federal grants aren't just money, they're contracts with the American people. When you accept federal funds for environmental protection and spend them on palm trees that increase flood risk, you're stealing from taxpayers who trusted you to improve their communities. The evidence file grew daily. Soil samples proving the environmental violations, financial records showing money diverted to unauthorized projects, communication records demonstrating deliberate deception in federal reports. Every document told the same story: willful disregard for federal law. But Sarah Campbell taught me something that every grant recipient should understand. Compliance requirements never expire, and ignorance isn't a defense in federal court. Even if current leadership inherited these problems, she explained, continuing to file false compliance reports makes them criminally liable for ongoing fraud. The physical documentation phase was meticulous. I created detailed site surveys showing how landscaping violated native species requirements, mapped drainage systems that didn't meet federal flood protection standards, photographed decorative features built with environmental protection funds. Each photo became evidence in a federal case that could send people to prison. Meanwhile, I was building a network of federal partners who understood the scope of violations. The EPA regional office needed to know about environmental crimes. County flood management required notification about drainage failures. The state agricultural department deserved warning about false rural development claims. The FBI white-collar crime unit was particularly interested. Grant fraud cases like this are perfect teaching tools, Agent Martinez explained during our initial briefing. Clear documentation, obvious violations, defendants who document their own crimes through social media. It's like they wrote the prosecution's closing argument for us. But here's where federal law enforcement differs from local disputes. Emotion doesn't matter, only evidence. My personal conflict with Bethann was irrelevant to federal prosecutors. What mattered was systematic violation of federal grant agreements, false reporting to federal agencies, and attempts to obstruct legitimate federal investigations. The psychological profile was textbook narcissistic personality disorder. Bethann's pattern showed escalation rather than backing down when confronted. Her history of frivolous litigation suggested she'd double down when faced with federal charges, creating additional evidence of criminal intent. Sarah Campbell was planning for multiple scenarios based on Bethann's psychological profile. If she cooperated, negotiate voluntary compliance and repayment, possible reduced charges. If she escalated, formal criminal referral and asset seizure to recover stolen federal funds. If she attempted to flee, federal marshals and interstate investigation capabilities. If she attacked federal employees, additional charges carrying mandatory minimum sentences. But the community element complicated everything. Innocent HOA residents didn't deserve to suffer for Bethann's crimes. Most had no knowledge of grant requirements or federal violations. Some were elderly residents on fixed incomes who couldn't afford special assessments to cover restitution payments. Federal prosecutors were surprisingly sympathetic to community concerns. "We're not interested in destroying innocent people's homes," Agent Martinez assured me. "Our goal is recovering stolen federal funds and preventing future fraud. If the community cooperates with compliance efforts, we can work with HOA insurance and minimize individual impact." The emotional preparation was the hardest part. Late evenings on my porch, watching stars appear over the hills, I struggled with using federal power against a personal enemy. Sarah's memory haunted these moments. She'd always believed in doing what was legally right rather than emotionally satisfying. "Dad," Emma said one evening, joining me with 2 glasses of sweet tea, "Mom would be proud of how you're handling this." The ice clinked against glass in the humid air as I considered her words. "How do you figure?" "You could have used your federal job to hurt her from the beginning, but you waited until she broke federal law. That's the difference between revenge and justice." Smart kid. Sometimes 17-year-olds see things more clearly than adults. The weight of federal responsibility felt different from personal anger. This wasn't about settling scores, it was about protecting federal programs that help rural communities develop infrastructure and environmental protection. Bethan's harassment had accidentally uncovered crimes against the American people. Now justice would be served with federal authority behind it. The trap was set. All we needed was for Bethan to spring it herself. The panic started when Bethan's neighbor mentioned seeing federal investigators at the county courthouse. What began as casual gossip over morning coffee became full-blown terror when she realized federal agents were photographing HOA property and taking soil samples from landscaped areas. For the first time since this whole mess started, Bethan Whitmore was scared. Her frantic internet research that night revealed the true scope of federal grant compliance requirements: prison sentences for grant fraud, massive financial penalties for environmental violations, asset seizure to recover stolen federal funds. Everything she thought she understood about local property disputes vanished when federal law entered the picture. The cover-up attempt was spectacular in its stupidity. Emergency HOA board meeting at 6 a.m. called to approve urgent landscaping corrections. Bethan pushed through a $40,000 contract to replace palm trees with native species overnight, claiming it was scheduled maintenance rather than panic-driven compliance theater. The sound of chainsaws filled the morning air as workers rushed to remove the exotic landscaping that screamed federal violation to anyone who understood grant requirements. The acrid smell of diesel exhaust mixed with sawdust as crews scrambled to modify drainage systems that had been decorative rather than functional. My cameras captured everything: time-stamped photos of frantic landscaping changes, audio recordings of Bethan screaming at contractors to work faster, video evidence of HOA board members questioning why thousands of dollars were being spent on emergency plant replacement. "Ma'am," I heard one contractor tell her, "replacing this many trees overnight is going to look suspicious to anyone who knows landscaping." "Just do it," she snapped back. "Send the bill to HOA insurance and claim it was storm damage." Insurance fraud, another federal crime to add to her growing collection. But the attempted cover-up created more violations than it fixed. Modifying federally funded projects without approval violates grant agreements and triggers automatic funding suspension. Her emergency changes actually made the federal case stronger. Here's something every grant recipient needs to understand. Attempting to modify federally funded projects without approval creates additional violations, even if you're trying to achieve compliance. The confrontation was inevitable. I was checking water troughs near the property line when Bethan marched across the pasture, designer boots slipping on cow patties, phone recording as always. The morning dew had turned to sticky humidity and her expensive workout clothes were already showing sweat stains. "This stops now," she announced, voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "Your federal harassment campaign ends today." I set down my feed bucket slowly. "Ma'am, I don't know what you're talking about. Don't play stupid with me. You're weaponizing your government position for personal vendettas. I'm exposing your corruption to every media outlet and congressional representative in Texas." She was recording everything, planning to use it as evidence of federal employee abuse. What she didn't understand was that threatening federal employees performing lawful duties is itself a federal crime. "You think you can hide behind your federal badge?" she continued, voice rising to near hysteria. "I'm going to destroy your career and expose how the USDA lets employees terrorize innocent citizens." The intimidation campaign expanded beyond just me. Bethan rallied sympathetic residents against what she called federal bullying, spreading rumors about my threatening the community with government retaliation. She contacted local media claiming exclusive story about federal employee abuse of power, providing selectively edited recordings of our confrontations. But her private investigator had been busy too. What he found was 15 years of community service, volunteer work with local schools, and military veteran status. Her attempt to find scandal in my personal life actually provided evidence of stellar character that made her accusations look ridiculous. Meanwhile, federal investigators were building an airtight case. The destroyed financial records had been recovered from HOA insurance claims and accounting firms. Email servers contained deleted communications discussing non-compliant spending. Bank records showed exactly where federal grant money had been diverted. Bethan's attempts to obstruct the investigation were creating new federal crimes faster than prosecutors could catalog them. The community fracture was becoming obvious at HOA meetings. Residents split between supporting Beth Ann's claims of government harassment and questioning why she was destroying documents and modifying landscaping without explanation. Some residents had researched federal grants independently and discovered the scope of potential violations. Others rallied around Beth Ann's narrative about out-of-control federal bureaucracy. The metallic taste of adrenaline had become familiar during increasingly hostile confrontations. Beth Ann's desperation was escalating beyond rational thought into genuine mental breakdown territory. Her nuclear option was hiring a lawyer to threaten federal prosecutors with media exposure and congressional investigation. What she didn't understand was that federal investigators love defendants who document their own crimes and threaten law enforcement. By trying to intimidate federal agents, Beth Ann had graduated from grant fraud to obstruction of justice. Each attempt to stop the investigation created evidence of consciousness of guilt. The trap was working perfectly. All we needed now was for her to completely destroy herself in public. The morning talk show appearance was Beth Ann's masterstroke, or so she thought. There she sat in the Austin studio, perfectly coiffed and camera-ready, telling her story about government intimidation of innocent homeowners to a sympathetic host who ate up every word. "This federal employee is using his position to settle personal scores," she explained, voice dripping with practiced victimization. "He's terrorizing our peaceful community because we dared to question his property rights." The edited recordings she provided painted me as an aggressive rancher making threats, while carefully omitting her own escalating harassment. Social media amplified her story faster than wildfire, with anti-government groups sharing her tale of David fighting the federal Goliath. Regional media picked up the story. Political blogs ran headlines about USDA inspector abuses power. Conservative talk radio hosts ranted about federal overreach. Liberal commentators criticized agricultural subsidies. Everyone had an opinion, but nobody had the facts. I watched the coverage from my kitchen table, coffee growing cold as my phone rang with interview requests I couldn't answer. Federal employees can't discuss ongoing investigations publicly, which made defending myself impossible. The bright glare of television cameras became routine as news vans parked outside our ranch gate. Reporters shouted questions about federal harassment while I fed cattle and tried to maintain normal routines. Emma had to take back roads to school to avoid the media circus. But while Beth Ann was winning the public relations war, federal investigators were building their case methodically. The FBI white-collar crime unit opened a formal investigation. Federal grand jury issued subpoenas for HOA financial records going back 5 years. EPA began environmental compliance review of all federally funded projects. IRS launched audit of HOA's tax-exempt status. Federal investigations operate independently of media coverage. Public pressure cannot stop legitimate criminal probes into grant fraud. That's when Beth Ann's closest ally betrayed her. Margaret Campbell had served on the HOA board for 3 years, supporting Beth Ann's property protection initiatives without question. But when federal subpoenas revealed the scope of grant violations, Margaret realized she faced personal liability as a board member who'd approved false federal reports. "I had no idea," she confessed to FBI agents, providing boxes of documents Beth Ann thought were destroyed. She told us the reports were routine paperwork, not federal legal documents. Margaret's cooperation revealed the full scope of Beth Ann's deception. Board members had unknowingly signed false federal compliance reports. Residents had been lied to about the source and restrictions on community improvements. Even the landscaping contractors had been deceived about federal grant requirements. Beth Ann's response to Margaret's betrayal was typical: escalate beyond rational thought. She attempted to frame me for property damage at HOA facilities. Security camera footage mysteriously disappeared after vandalism appeared at the community center. A false police report claimed I'd made physical threats during a confrontation that never happened. The static electricity from microphones had become familiar as reporters pressed for statements I couldn't give. Federal employees must maintain silence during ongoing investigations, which Beth Ann interpreted as admission of guilt rather than legal requirement. But my cameras had captured everything. Video evidence showed Beth Ann planting spray paint cans near my truck. Audio recordings proved her police report contained manufactured quotes from conversations that never occurred. Time-stamped footage demonstrated she'd destroyed her own security cameras to eliminate evidence. False police reports, evidence tampering, obstruction of justice. Each desperate attempt to frame me created new federal crimes. The community reckoning came at an emergency HOA meeting that felt more like a war crimes tribunal. Residents learned about potential personal liability for federal violations they'd never known existed. Insurance companies questioned coverage for deliberate federal crimes. Property values plummeted as news of grant fraud investigations spread. "How could you not tell us we were liable for federal grants?" demanded resident after resident. Bethan's responses grew increasingly unhinged. She blamed Margaret for betraying the community, accused federal agents of conspiracy, claimed I'd orchestrated everything through corrupt government connections. The cold touch of handcuffs was still weeks away, but everyone in that room could feel the inevitability. Federal investigations don't end in negotiated settlements, they end in indictments. Bethan's final desperation was attempting to flee with remaining HOA funds. Federal marshals froze assets pending investigation, trapping her in a community that now despised her. Bank accounts locked, credit cards canceled. Even her husband's retirement accounts scrutinized for commingled federal funds. The smell of coffee and donuts at press conferences had become routine as federal prosecutors prepared for public announcement of the investigation. Bethan still believed media pressure could stop federal law enforcement. She was about to learn that federal crimes require federal consequences regardless of public opinion. The final confrontation was being scheduled for maximum impact, a community meeting with federal agents present, media coverage guaranteed, and Bethan walking directly into a federal trap she'd spent months building for herself. Justice was coming with handcuffs and federal authority behind it. The community center had never seen anything like it. Federal agents in crisp suits contrasting sharply with the folding chairs and coffee-stained tables where residents normally discussed pool maintenance and parking violations. Evidence boxes stacked along the walls. Display boards showing before and after photos of grant violations. Court orders and asset seizure notices arranged with prosecutorial precision. I sat in the back row, required to attend as a federal witness despite the personal conflict that had started this whole mess. The collective gasp from 200 residents when they saw the FBI badges was audible even over the air conditioning's mechanical hum. Bethan arrived 15 minutes late, expecting routine HOA business. She'd dressed for another performance, designer blazer, professional makeup, confident stride that faltered the moment she saw federal marshals positioned at every exit. "What is this?" she demanded, voice already climbing toward panic. Federal prosecutor Amanda Richardson stood at the makeshift podium, voice carrying the weight of 20 years prosecuting white-collar crime. The sharp crack of her gavel opening the proceedings silenced every whispered conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here today to announce formal federal charges against Bethan Louise Whitmore for systematic fraud involving federal grant programs totaling $340,000. The rustle of legal documents being distributed filled the sudden silence as residents received copies of the indictment. 47 separate federal charges: grant fraud, environmental violations, obstruction of justice, false statements to federal agencies, wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud the United States. But Richardson wasn't finished. Mrs. Whitmore's crimes span multiple years and involved deliberate deception of federal agencies responsible for environmental protection and rural development. She accepted federal money designated for flood mitigation and spent it on decorative fountains. She promised native species restoration and installed palm trees that increase flood risk. She filed false compliance reports claiming environmental work that was never completed. Bethan's face cycled through disbelief, rage, and terror as the scope of federal charges became clear. She'd expected local legal problems, not federal crimes carrying mandatory minimum sentences. Furthermore, Richardson continued, Mrs. Whitmore's recent attempts to obstruct this investigation have resulted in additional charges for destruction of federal evidence, intimidation of federal witnesses, and conspiracy to impede federal law enforcement. The technical explanation was devastating in its simplicity. When you accept federal money for environmental protection but spend it on cosmetic improvements, that's theft from American taxpayers. When you lie to federal agencies about compliance with grant requirements, that's fraud. When you attempt to destroy evidence and intimidate federal employees, that's obstruction of justice. Bethan's final desperate speech was everything federal prosecutors had hoped for. "This is persecution," she screamed, voice echoing off the community center's cheap acoustic tiles. "This federal employee orchestrated this harassment campaign because we dared to challenge his property rights. He's weaponizing the federal government for personal revenge." Camera flashes captured every word as she implicated herself further. "I had every right to protect our community from his agricultural operations. Those federal grants were legally obtained and properly used. This is a conspiracy between corrupt federal employees and political enemies. Each sentence provided evidence of consciousness of guilt while denying crimes that were documented with federal evidence. Richardson's response was the mic drop moment this story deserved. Mrs. Whitmore, federal grant compliance is not a matter of opinion. Environmental violations are not subject to democratic vote. Your personal disputes with neighbors do not exempt you from federal law. The evidence speaks for itself. She gestured to the display board showing aerial photographs of grant violations, financial records proving fund diversions, communication records demonstrating deliberate deception, environmental assessments revealing compliance failures. This investigation was triggered by your own harassment campaign against a federal employee performing his lawful duties. Your attempts to intimidate federal law enforcement created evidence of criminal intent. You documented your own crimes through social media posts and recorded conversations. The asset seizure announcement was surgical in its precision. Federal marshals would immediately freeze Beth Ann's personal assets to secure restitution for stolen federal funds. Her home, vehicles, investment accounts, and jewelry would be evaluated for seizure. Even her husband's retirement accounts faced scrutiny for commingled federal money. But the community protection was equally important. Innocent residents who were deceived about federal grant requirements will not face personal liability for Mrs. Whitmore's crimes. HOA insurance will cover most restitution obligations. New community management will ensure future federal compliance. Beth Ann's arrest on live television was almost anticlimactic. The cold click of handcuffs, the Miranda rights read in monotone federal efficiency, the perp walk through a crowd of neighbors who'd finally learned the truth about their HOA president's criminal activity. As federal vehicles drove away with Beth Ann in custody, residents began asking the questions they should have asked years ago about federal grants, compliance requirements, and the woman they'd trusted to manage their community. Justice had finally arrived, with federal authority and handcuffs to back it up. 6 months later, Beth Ann Whitmore stood in federal court wearing orange jumpies instead of designer clothes, listening to Judge Patricia Stevens deliver her sentence. 5 years federal prison, $400,000 restitution, 3 years supervised release with restrictions on managing federal funds or serving on community boards. Mrs. Whitmore, the judge said, you stole money meant to protect communities from flooding. You lied to federal agencies trusted to safeguard taxpayer investments. You attempted to intimidate federal employees performing their lawful duties. Your actions represent everything that undermines public trust in government programs designed to help rural communities. The gavel's final crack echoed through the courtroom, ending 2 years of harassment, federal investigation, and community turmoil. Back home in Willowbrook Estates, healing had already begun. The new HOA leadership focused on actual community improvement rather than personal power trips. Margaret Campbell, elected president after Beth Ann's arrest, worked tirelessly to rebuild trust and ensure federal compliance. Property values stabilized once federal violations were corrected and environmental improvements properly completed. The flood protection systems actually worked now. Native landscaping attracted local wildlife while preventing erosion. Proper drainage handled heavy rainfall without flooding residential streets. Federal grants had finally delivered the community benefits they were designed to provide. My easement rights were permanently protected by federal court order, ending any future disputes about ranch access. The gate that had started this whole mess now bore a small federal marker confirming permanent agricultural rights established in 1952. Emma and I processed the stress of 2 years of legal warfare during long evenings on the porch, watching stars appear over the hills that would remain agricultural land forever. The sweet smell of hay and the distant lowing of cattle had replaced the tension that once filled our nights. Dad, she said one evening, Mom would be proud of how you handled everything. Sarah's memory had guided every decision during the federal investigation, doing what was legally right rather than emotionally satisfying, protecting federal programs that help rural communities, maintaining integrity when personal attacks would have justified revenge. The practical lessons for viewers were clear. Always research easement rights before purchasing property near agricultural areas. Federal grant compliance requirements are permanent obligations that transfer with property ownership. Document harassment campaigns with time-stamped evidence. Professional ethics sometimes align perfectly with personal justice. The Sarah Sullivan Memorial Scholarship launched that fall, funded partially through my legal settlement for harassment damages. Emma and I established partnerships with the reformed HOA on environmental education programs, creating a model for rural-suburban cooperation that other communities were already studying. Federal programs benefited from our experience too. The USDA created new oversight protocols preventing similar grant fraud. Environmental compliance training became mandatory for all grant recipients. Our case became a teaching example in federal law enforcement training, showing how personal disputes can uncover systematic government fraud. Regional media eventually got the story right, reporting on federal grant fraud rather than manufactured harassment claims. Local reporters learned to verify federal employee allegations before amplifying politically motivated accusations. The ongoing legacy was exactly what Sarah would have wanted. Our ranch continued operation with modernized facilities and guaranteed federal protection for agricultural activities. The community enjoyed improved environmental protection and proper flood mitigation. Property values increased due to legitimate federal compliance and genuine community improvements. Beth Ann's appeals failed at every level. Federal convictions stood without modification. Asset seizure recovered most stolen funds. Prison sentence proceeded without early release options. But the real victory was community transformation. Residents learned to research their leaders' backgrounds before elections. Federal grant obligations became part of routine HOA education. Environmental improvements attracted families who valued both rural character and suburban amenities. Standing at my gate on a clear Texas morning, coffee steam mixing with dawn mist, I watched cattle graze in pastures that would remain agricultural forever. Federal court protection guaranteed that no future HOA president could threaten our family's 3-generation legacy. Emma joined me with 2 glasses of sweet tea, ice clinking against glass in the humid air. "So what's next, Dad?" "Same as always," I told her. "Take care of the land, take care of the cattle, and trust that doing the right thing eventually pays off." Share your own HOA nightmare stories in the comments. What's the craziest power trip you've witnessed in your neighborhood? And hit that subscribe button for more stories about regular people defeating corrupt systems through patience and proper legal channels. Because sometimes justice really does win in the end.
Thanks for hanging out with us on HOA Stories, where the HOA Karens meet their match. If this story had you cheering or cringing, go ahead and like the video, drop a comment with your reaction, and hit subscribe so you're ready for the next wild HOA tale.